For more than 2 decades, the Tom Clancy's franchise meant something specific. A promise of grounded military tactical gameplay, and an adherence to realism that set these titles apart from their contemporaries. In an industry increasingly dominated by World War games, Tom Clancy games carved out their own space by appealing to a different kind of audience. One that was looking for tactical, methodical, and at times even strategic gameplay that stuck to the themes and settings it was presented in. There was a time that people were genuinely excited by a new Tom Clancy's game, a time where these titles were looked at as pioneers of their respective genre. However, this reputation was not built overnight. The origins of the Tom Clancy franchise can be traced back to the late 1990s, when Red Storm Entertainment, the studio co-founded by Tom Clancy himself, released Rainbow Six in 1998. The game was a revelation for PC players who at the time were accustomed to much faster paced games like Quake 2 or Unreal. Instead of constant movement and arcade style gunplay, Rainbow Six emphasised slow and methodical pacing and the terrifying fragility of its operators. One bullet could kill you, and often it would. For players hungry for authenticity, this was a breath of fresh air. In those early years, Tom Clancy himself was involved in shaping the vision and tone of these games, and his background as a military espionage novelist helped define their identity. His novels were famous for their geopolitical intrigue, technical detail and human drama, and the games under his banner inherited that same DNA. Whether you were infiltrating terrorist strongholds in Rainbow Six, conducting covert operations in Ghost Recon, or slipping through the shadows in Splinter Cell, there was a unifying philosophy. Over time, the brand expanded beyond its initial tactical shooter roots. Ubisoft, who acquired Red Storm in 2000, began to experiment with different sub-series. Ghost Recon took the tactical realism of Rainbow Six and brought it to open outdoor battlefields. Splinter Cell entered the stealth action genre, giving Ubisoft its own answer to Metal Gear Solid. Even Hawks, an arcade-style aerial combat game, carried the Tom Clancy name, showing that the brand could stretch its scope without losing all of its identity. But somewhere along the way, that identity began to fade. What was once a mark of quality, a signifier of a unique style of game design, became instead a marketing tool. The realism gave way to spectacle. The deliberate pacing was replaced by constant action. The intricate planning systems were simplified, streamlined, or removed entirely. By the time Ghost Recon Breakpoint released in 2019, and even many years before that, many fans felt that the Tom Clancy brand no longer stood for anything at all. Had become just another Ubisoft property, designed for the broadest possible audience, chasing trends rather than setting them. The downfall of the Tom Clancy series is not just a story of a franchise losing its way, it's a reflection of larger shifts within Ubisoft and the video game industry as a whole. The move toward live service models, the prioritization of monetization over player experience, and the erosion of niche genres in favour of mainstream homogenized products. But before we get into all of that, let's go all the way back to the 1990s. The original Rainbow Six was a revelation in 1998. Developed by Red Storm Entertainment, it introduced the concept of pre-mission planning on a scale no other shooter had done. Before actually playing, players would spend time in the planning interface, setting waypoints, coordinating entry points, and assigning rules of engagement for AI squadmates. Success depended on preparation as much as execution. One mistake could fail an entire operation. Its sequel, Rainbow Six Rogue Spear in 1999, refined the mechanics and presented more elaborate missions while keeping the same grounded tone. With Rainbow Six 3 Raven Shield in 2003, the series hit its mechanical stride. Running on Unreal Engine 2, Raven Shield delivered smoother animations, better AI and more immersive environments, all while retaining the one-shot ability and pre-planning depth that defined the series. But it was with the Rainbow Six Vegas games that the series truly hit the mainstream without sacrificing too much of its identity. At least not yet. Vegas introduced a now iconic cover system, a cinematic campaign, and a robust multiplayer. The planning phase was mostly gone, replaced by in-the-moment tactical decisions, but the pacing and difficulty still demanded patience. While Rainbow Six dealt with counter-terrorism and close-quarter environments, Ghost Recon focused on large-scale outdoor operations. The original Ghost Recon in 2001 was brutally unforgiving. With minimal HUD elements, no regenerating health and wide open battlefields, the game forced players to think like a military commander. Squad position, fields of fire and line of sight were critical. Deaths were permanent for the duration of a campaign, raising the stakes for every engagement. Ghost Recon Island Thunder and Jungle Storm carried the formula forward, but it was Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter in 2006 that brought the series into the modern era. Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter merged tactical gameplay with cutting-edge visuals, while its sequel, Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter 2, refined the formula with better AI and more polished mission design. These games were demanding, but still rewarding. The last great entry of this period, Ghost Recon Future Soldier in 2012, began to show hints of Ubisoft's changing priorities. The pacing was faster, the gadgetry flashier, and the campaign more scripted, but it still delivered enough tactical depth to satisfy fans. It was cinematic without being hollow, and it sold well enough to hint at the bright future for the series, a promise Ubisoft would later squander. Perhaps the crown jewel of the Tom Clancy brand during its golden age was Splinter Cell. When the first game released in 2002, it set a new standard for stealth gameplay. Compared to Metal Gear Solid, Splinter Cell was colder, more grounded, and more punishing. Light and shadow weren't just aesthetic elements, they were core mechanics. The noise you made, the gadgets you used, the angle of your approach, everything mattered. Splinter Cell Pandora Tomorrow in 2004 refined the stealth systems and introduced a revolutionary Spies vs Mercs multiplayer mode. A tense asymmetrical battle between slow-moving stealth operatives and heavily armed mercenaries. Chaos Theory in 2005 is widely considered the peak of the series and arguably one of the greatest stealth games ever made. It offered open-ended mission design, branching paths, and multiple ways to approach objectives, rewarding creativity and also offering a ton of replayability. Double Agent in 2006 experimented with a more narrative-driven approach, allowing Sam Fisher to walk a moral tightrope between his handlers and the criminal organisations he infiltrated. While divisive, it still upheld the franchise's emphasis on choice and consequence. Finally, Conviction in 2010 and Blacklist in 2013 modernised the series with faster pacing and more aggressive combat options. These games sparked debate. Were they still true Splinter Cell experiences, or had Ubisoft streamlined them too much? Regardless, they retained enough complexity and high production value to keep fans engaged, marking the end of the Splinter Cell series. What united these series during this time, though, was a shared belief that the player was intelligent. Ubisoft didn't treat its audience as impatient or incapable of learning systems. These games rewarded thought, punished recklessness, and fostered a feeling of mastery. The Tom Clancy label meant you could expect a grounded, technically competent, and tonally consistent experience. The irony is that the period ended not because the audience abandoned these games, but because Ubisoft decided they could make more money chasing a different one. By the early 2010s, the seeds of the downfall had already been planted, and in the next era, those seeds would bear fruit. The years between 2012 and 2014 were pivotal for the Tom Clancy franchise, not because of a single disastrous release, but because Ubisoft's internal philosophy shifted in ways that would ripple across every one of its core series. The company had grown into one of the largest publishers in the world, riding high on the success of Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and its other multiplayer titles. But with that growth came a change in how Ubisoft approached game development. The traditional Ubisoft of the 2000s was a collection of semi-autonomous studios, each capable of creating games with distinct identities. The Montreal, Paris and Shanghai teams all worked on Tom Clancy titles, and while they shared some DNA, the differences were clear. Splinter Cell didn't feel like Ghost Recon, and Ghost Recon didn't feel like Rainbow Six. The focus was on crafting a polished, targeted experience for a specific audience. By the mid-2010s, that approach was being replaced with what many fans came to call the Ubisoft formula. The publisher began to centralise its development pipeline, sharing assets, mechanics, and even world design philosophies across multiple franchises. This had the advantage of lowering costs and speeding up development, but it also meant games started to lose their individuality. In this environment, Ubisoft's executives began chasing larger markets. Niche tactical shooters were no longer the priority. The financial logic was simple. Why sell a few million copies to a dedicated core audience when you could tweak the formula, add accessibility features, and sell to tens of millions? Unfortunately, this strategy clashed with what had made Tom Clancy games special in the first place. Perhaps the most consequential shift came with Ubisoft's embrace of the live service model. This wasn't unique to Ubisoft. The entire industry was pivoting in this direction following the successes of games like Fortnite, Destiny, and even GTA Online. But Ubisoft saw an opportunity to turn its Tom Clancy's properties into ongoing revenue streams rather than one-time purchases. The appeal was obvious from a business standpoint. A live service game doesn't just sell you the base product. It sells you cosmetics, expansions, and battle passes for months or even years after launch. For Ubisoft, the prospect of a loyal player base spending money year round was too tempting to ignore. The problem was that the live service model often ran counter to the design principles of tactical shooters. These games traditionally had slower pacing, deliberate mission structures, and a clear endpoint. Qualities that don't lend themselves well to endless repeatable content loops. To make them fit, Ubisoft had to sand down the edges, speeding up gameplay, simplifying systems, and reducing the skill gap to appeal to as many players as possible. Splinter Cell Blacklist and Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter were the last Tom Clancy games that were still, up to a certain extent, sticking to the identity that had popularised the franchise in the beginning. They had some differences from previous games that fans didn't like, but they were still distinguishable from one another and had their own identity. After Ghost Recon Future Soldier, Ubisoft went on to release Ghost Recon Phantoms in 2014, which was a PC exclusive and was the first major sign of the franchise heading toward its downfall. The game was a multiplayer experience only. Players chose from 3 different classes that all came with their own abilities, and the game by many players was considered pay to win. The game was also free to play, which at the time was quite unusual, but that also meant the game heavily relied on microtransactions. The game itself wasn't bad, the cover system was really well executed, and the tempo of the game wasn't fast paced. The methodical and even at times strategic approach was still a viable option to play the game. But it's the skins, microtransactions, and everything that has now become the industry standard that signalled in which direction the entire franchise was heading. And looking back at this game, it looks like a lot of the elements, especially some of the UI and HUD, were used in the Division game. This game would later be shut down in 2016, and a big reason for that was because of another Tom Clancy game that released in 2015. Rainbow Six Siege was the first mainline Rainbow Six game since Rainbow Six Vegas 2. The game is a tactical competitive shooter where 2 teams of 5 face off in various game modes. The game is centred around real life counter-terrorist units, which is in line with what the Rainbow Six series has always been about. However, the game is a hero shooter, and most importantly, it doesn't have a campaign, something that was always the bread and butter of the series. It did, however, lean into the slower, methodical gameplay, especially because of the destruction, something that was a major selling point of the game. Games were more about communication and tactics than sheer aim and reflexes. The operators had gadgets that made sense and were believable. The skins for the operators were grounded and realistic. The game was a massive success, and to this day remains one of the most unique FPS games on the market. But throughout the years, the game has lost that identity. It no longer looks like a Tom Clancy game, let alone a Rainbow Six one. The skins have only gotten more outlandish, the operators and gadgets more futuristic, and the microtransactions even worse. I mean, what the fuck is this Valkyrie skin? The Rainbow Six Siege of today is nothing like what the game was when it released. It's almost unrecognisable. What started as a tactical shooter with a grounded realistic theme has turned into a playground where Master Chief and Rick and Morty can fight against each other. It has also lost that Rainbow Six identity that fans initially fell in love with, and possibly shows just how much the Tom Clancy franchise has changed for the worse. In 2016, Ubisoft released a new Tom Clancy series called The Division. The Division was Ubisoft's chance to have a shot at the extraction shooter mode, and to their credit, the tone and setting of the game was pretty good. The game was set in a post-pandemic New York City and had a darker tone to it. The game had the classic cover system and a campaign. However, enemies were extremely spongy and missions were largely repetitive. The main gameplay loop of The Division consisted of grinding levels and getting new gear and weapons, and once you got to the end game, there simply wasn't much to do. You had to go into the dark zone, only have to deal with an abundance of cheaters. The Division seemed like a game that wasn't really a Tom Clancy game, but rather a Ubisoft shooter with the Tom Clancy name just slapped on top of it to get people interested. The sequel in 2019 was received even worse, mainly because it was still the same game, but set in a less interesting place. Washington just didn't quite have the same vibe as New York did. The game also lacked any meaningful content and was filled with bugs. As a whole, the Division franchise wasn't what a Tom Clancy game should be. It didn't have any of the same principles. Whereas in the old games you had to plan your approach and carefully consider your move, you had to make every shot count because one headshot could kill you. In the Division, the enemies could take an absurd amount of bullets before dying. It didn't share any of the tactical realistic gameplay that older games did. In 2017, the Ghost Recon series finally received a new entry in the franchise. A long-awaited return had finally arrived. That game was Ghost Recon Wildlands, an open Ghost Recon game that was set in Bolivia and at the time featured the biggest open world environment that Ubisoft had ever created. However, that massive open world was what hurt it the most. The gameplay of Ghost Recon Wildlands was actually quite good and enjoyable. The game had a campaign, it wasn't anything to write home about, but at least it offered one. It was focused on taking down several drug cartels and ultimately killing the main kingpin. The issue is that it didn't really feel like a Ghost Recon game, not in the traditional sense anyway. It felt more like its own new thing. You could still dish out command orders to your squad and the game was still somewhat tactical, but the hardcore high stakes gameplay was non-existent. It felt more like a Far Cry game cosplaying as a Tom Clancy game. The missions and quests are mostly the same and quickly became repetitive. The slower, more methodical gameplay was largely gone. You could just rush in and clear entire outposts by yourself. The aesthetic of the game was also off. Older Ghost Recon games had a gritty and even at times grimy look to them. The colour palette was washed out and the environments felt like actual places where conflict took place. Whereas in Ghost Recon Wildlands, the colours are vibrant and when travelling around the map, you can't really see the effect the drug cartels have had on the area. At times, the game could even feel like The Division with some of its mechanics. However, the series diverted from its roots even further with Ghost Recon Breakpoint, a game that for many solidified the idea that this was no longer the Ghost Recon they fell in love with. The big open world is even worse this time around. The story was largely forgettable. The only real saving grace of Ghost Recon Breakpoint was and still is the modern community that transforms the game into what you would consider more of a Ghost Recon title. But overall, the game felt like another Ubisoft game, something that not only Tom Clancy games suffered from at this point, but the majority of Ubisoft games. The game is also filled with microtransactions and season passes and even battle pass. Items now had rarity too, making the game seem more like The Division even more. I said earlier in the video that in the earlier years it was easy to distinguish between Rainbow Six, Ghost Recon and Splinter Cell. They all had their own aesthetic and gameplay mechanics, their own identity. Well, these games now suffered from a lack of those things. Gameplay mechanics were often the same, mainly because it was easy and saved time and money to simply transfer mechanics from one game to the other. Their identities often merged into one. Skins are outlandish, especially in Rainbow Six Siege. There's clearly prioritised profit over player satisfaction. The thing is that these games aren't all that bad. If they were released under a different name, I think they would be received differently. But with that being said, Ubisoft did try that with Defiant. Defiant was supposed to be Ubisoft's answer to Call of Duty. More importantly, it was trying to target the older fans of Call of Duty who missed the arcadey feel of the game. The game had specialists from different Tom Clancy games that had their own abilities. The game felt nothing like a Tom Clancy game, and although initially it was under the Tom Clancy name, Ubisoft chose to remove it and simply called it Defiant, while still keeping the operators from Ghost Recon, Splinter Cell and The Division. So although the name was gone, the operators stayed, and so did the players for a while, until the game eventually died, and the game was shut down in June this year. The last decade or so has been tough for the Tom Clancy franchise, mainly because Ubisoft has forgot what made the game a success in the first place. People want a realistic military experience that is both tactical and lethal. They want a Splinter Cell game that actually focuses on the narrative as much as it does on the stealth mechanics. It wants a game that looks and feels like a counter-terrorist game, not like a Call of Duty with the Tom Clancy name slapped on it. The Tom Clancy brand was once one of gaming's most dependable names, shorthand for immersive, tactically rich experiences rooted in military realism. Today, it feels like a brand stretched so thin that even the name itself no longer carries the weight it once did. It's become associated with trench chasing live service games and creative directions that drift further from its original identity. The downfall hasn't been the result of a single catastrophic misstep, but a long chain of compromises, both creative and commercial. Ubisoft's decision to chase the largest possible audience came at the expense of the brand's core appeal. The resulting games may have been more accessible, but they were also less distinct. What's most frustrating is that the decline was not inevitable. There is still an audience for the kinds of experiences that built the Tom Clancy legacy. The success of modern tactical shooters like Ready or Not, the enduring love for the Splinter Cell series, and the sustained player base for games with slow and methodical pacing show that there's room in the market for something different from all the battle royales and extraction shooters. The road back would require Ubisoft to re-embrace the principles that made these games great in the first place. That doesn't mean clinging to the past out of nostalgia, but rather using those design philosophies as a foundation for innovation. Imagine a new Splinter Cell that combines the deliberate stealth of chaos theory with modern environmental interactivity and AI. Imagine a Ghost Recon that brings back the tension of operating behind enemy lines, with an open world that rewards planning as much as shooting. Imagine a Rainbow Six that reintroduces its planning phase, allowing players to set up breaches, synchronize takedowns, and feel like a real counter-terrorism game again. The challenge isn't purely creative. Ubisoft would need to accept that these kind of games may not monetize like a Battle Pass driven live service game. They need to place a higher value on brand integrity. That's a hard sell in today's market, where quarterly earnings drive so many development decisions. But as the current state of the Clancy brand proves, constantly chasing trends is not a sustainable long-term strategy. If Ubisoft truly wants to restore the Tom Clancy name to its former glory, it has to commit to making games that no one else is making. Games that feel a niche and create their own audience, just as Rainbow Six, Ghost Recon and Splinter Cell once did. That means resisting the urge to bolt on battle passes and shoehorn in microtransactions, and instead focusing on building worlds and mechanics that feel authentic, immersive and rewarding. Right now, the Tom Clancy brand is at a crossroads. It can continue down the current path, release and dilute its spin-off and experimental multiplayer projects that slowly chip away at whatever legacy remains. Or it can recognise that the best way forward might be to look back, not to copy the past exactly, but to understand what made it resonate so strongly in the first place. The fall of the Tom Clancy series is a story about identity, how it was built, how it was compromised and how it could be rebuilt. The name may have been devalued in recent years, but names can be redeemed, legacies can be restored. The question is whether Ubisoft has the will to take the hard road, the one that prioritises vision over trends, depth over reach, and authenticity over accessibility. Because if they do, there's still a chance that when we see a new Tom Clancy game, it will once again mean something, and not just to those of us who remember for what it used to stand for, but to an entirely new generation of players, discovering for themselves the magic of a game that challenges you to think before you pull the trigger.